Today we'll be going through a carburetor on a Bombardier Quest 650, and this is going to be the same as the John Deere Buck. So, and real similar to the 500 Quests and the Tracksters as well. So this is a 2012 model, and we're going to go through the carburetor here. We've got your throttle, where your throttle cable comes into here. Obviously, if we have it off of the four-wheeler, we've already taken this cover off, but just to show you what's going on here. 3 Phillips screws that we've got to take out, and there is an O-ring under here that seals this. Now when you're putting the O-ring back, if you've gotten carb cleaner on it or fuel or anything, that O-ring will expand and it'll be very hard to fit in here. So you want to make sure you set out in the sun, use a hair dryer, dry it off really good, kind of heat it up a little bit, and eventually that'll shrink down to where you want it to be. We've got your throttle cable that runs in here. It sits on this little clip here, and that goes in that groove there. So adjusting your idles is as simple as turning this thumb screw here, and all that is doing is opening up this butterfly. And if we were to go do a drastic idle adjust, this would be turning the idle way up. Clockwise is turning that idle way up. So that is the throttle cable part of it there. Now we've got the top here, the top cap on your, this is the diaphragm underneath this. 2 Phillips screws to remove this. Now I'll show you a little trick here. A lot of times if your diaphragm is bad, then your carburetor won't do this. When you blow in this port here, that slide should go up with your needle. So if it doesn't do that, it doesn't move freely, doesn't come back down freely, then you've got problems up here. Just go ahead and take these 2 Phillips screws off. And none of these Phillips screws needs to be torqued down very hard. It just makes it a challenge for the next person. So same thing, this diaphragm here seals up with this rubber, with the rubber diaphragm. You want to make sure that that comes down in there and seats properly in that groove. Now that slide there with the diaphragm is here. You can only put that in one direction, and to pull your needle, there's just a clip in there that you just pull out. Your needle will come out, and you can clean it if you need to. Make sure that this needle is free of any kind of grooves. Make sure it's not bent or damaged. Make sure there's not buildup on that needle there before going back together. Next, we'll go ahead and pull the bowl of the carburetor off. If you're draining your fuel for the year, or if you got bad fuel in there, sometimes you're lucky enough to get that fuel to drain out the bottom, and you don't have to pull this bowl and clean these jets. 9 times out of 10, though, you still have to pull this bowl. But if you're draining it for the year, just go ahead and take a flat or a Phillips screw and screwdriver and pull this out. You just have to go out a couple turns, and that fuel will dump out this bottom tab here on the bottom. This you don't want to drain directly on your motor. It over time will discolor your motor. If your motor's hot, it could potentially start a fire. So you want to make sure that you've got a fuel hose going on here that goes around to the bottom of the motor. So then when all your fuel is drained out, then you can tighten that screw back in. That will drain all the fuel that's in here. If you leave your fuel tank petcock on, then you're just going to drain your entire fuel tank. And I'd suggest shutting your fuel petcock off on your four-wheeler and then draining this. Next thing we're going to do is pull this bowl off here. 4 Phillips screws. Again, these don't have to be very tight. And also, there is an O-ring that seals this that you may have the same problem with going back together. If it gets fuel on it or carb cleaner, these things will expand. So there's your O-ring there. You want to make sure that's in very good condition before going back together. Make sure it's seated in that groove properly. Now when your float is not set at the correct height, a lot of times you'll have fuel that'll dump out of this port here, and it'll go out the bottom. Just the same if you're traveling. That's kind of a safety deal there, so that fuel does not go down into the motor. It drains out there. So now we'll pull this float off here, and that takes a Phillips screw to remove that. You just have to loosen that Phillips screw there, in order to get this far enough off. Now to adjust your needle and seat height, all you simply do is pull this off here, and you wouldn't even actually have to pull this off to adjust your needle seat height, but there is your tab there to adjust it, and you can go down or up depending on if you're dumping way too much fuel into your carburetor or not enough. Now you want to make sure that you're not doing this to fix a fuel needle and seat problem. Your fuel will come in here from your fuel tank, go down through your needle and seat here. It'll go down through your seat. Now if your needle is grooved or your seat here is grooved, if sometimes they get squared from your needle, just going up and down constantly, wearing on this brass fitting, you can replace this just by taking this little Phillips screw out, pull that out, make sure that your O-rings are seated properly on your new one, and slide that back in. Tighten the Phillips there and put your needle, a new needle on as well. These get grooved, sometimes they get rubber from your fuel hose stuck down in there, sand, anything that's coming from your fuel tank. That's why it's a good idea to have an inline fuel filter on these. It kind of catches that debris before it gets into here. So next we're going to pull your pilot jet. Pilot jet is the one that's farthest down here. So go ahead and remove this pilot jet, and it's going to be the smallest of the ports of all the jets. So you want to hold it up to light, make sure that you can see through it, blow carbon choke cleaner out. I use the GumOut brand. It I think works the best out of any of them. And then you can take compressed air, blow through it. Just make sure that when you hold it up to light, you can see through it. Make sure there's no debris inside of there. So a lot of times, if your four-wheeler has a hard time starting, this is a lot of times the issue. It's such small ports. If you have any kind of sand in there at all, then it will cause that not to start. Then we're going to go to the secondary main jet, and that's this one here. That's the one that's, your main jet is sitting directly under your slide and your needle here. That'll go right up into your main jet. And then we've got a smaller ported, this is the secondary main jet. On this one, this jet is 75, and this one's 152.5. So just about double the size here, and that isn't always the case, but in this case it is. So we'll pull your secondary main jet, same thing, make sure you can hold up to light, see through it. If you need to, GumOut carbon choke cleaner, spray it through there, and blow through it with compressed air. Make sure you can see through it when you hold it up to light. Pull your pilot jet or your main jet here. Make sure that your screwdriver is on there good and tight before you start turning, so you don't strip out these brass jets. It makes them just a challenge to get out. We've got your needle jet holder here, and you can pull that as well. There's an O-ring that sits underneath there. A lot of times your pilot jet will be plugged up before your main jet holder, because this is a bigger port. So your slide or your needle from your slide and needle is going to go right down into this jet here. So same thing, make sure you can see through it, hold it up to light, and then blow through it with compressed air. Now if you can see that, you can look directly down from your slide and your needle here up where your diaphragm is. You should be able to see all the way through. Take compressed air, blow everything out really good, and then you can go back together. The last thing I want to show you here is the air fuel screw, and that is kind of a spring-loaded screw so that it holds it in there. So before you take your carburetor apart, you want to count how many turns in this air fuel screw is. And if you screw this all the way in here, what I do is half turn, 1, 1.5, 2, 2 1/4. So we go quarter, half, 1, half, 2. We got 2 1/4 there. So now we're going to put this carburetor back together. We'll start by putting the pilot jet in there. Again, you don't have to torque these down very hard. It's brass going into aluminum, so they are generally going to not take much of a torque to tighten them up. But also you want to make sure that they don't fall out when you're riding. So we got your secondary main, again goes in this one, and that's the smaller of the two. In this case it's the 75, depending on altitude, what's done to the four-wheeler, exhaust, air filter, stuff like that. We've got your main jet going on now, and make sure you can see that here. This is a cup here. You use the deepest side to slide that main jet in. You don't put it this way. Your main jet should not be sticking above this cap, and it won't even allow you to do that. But screw this main jet in now. Make sure they're snug, because this carburetor is going to be sitting the opposite direction. So if they are loose, they'll just work themselves right out. Needle and seat, just make sure it sits on there. It doesn't matter which direction this needle sits on there. That clip is right in the center. Then tighten up this Phillips screw. Make sure that your float here doesn't have any kind of damage at all. Any cracking, you want to replace it. Any kind of buildup, just make sure it's really clean before you go back together. We'll put your bowl back on here. This only goes on one direction. And then on this particular bowl, you've got a damper here that sits on the bottom. That's just to keep that from vibrating against the motor. We pulled it off because when you spray carbon choke cleaner on that black bumper, it just gets black all over the place. Putting the throttle cover back on here. You wouldn't actually do this until it gets to be on the four-wheeler, because you're going to have a problem with getting the cable on. But a lot of times what you can do is grease, put just a touch of grease on here, and that kind of holds it. Also what you can do, and you can a lot of times feel it when it drops in, but you can get one side in, put it down, then you can take a screwdriver and kind of push it in all the way around. Just putting a little bit of pressure on there, and then you can feel it drop in as soon as it falls into place. This isn't as important. It is important, but not as important as this diaphragm. You don't want to pinch that diaphragm on top there. This will go one direction, and your O-ring part of that will sit right down on that O-ring on the carburetor. Now what I like to do is turn this over like this, and then you put your finger underneath here so it doesn't drop all the way down. Make sure your needle is falling directly into your main jet holder. Sometimes you have to guide that down. And then let it go down until it's seated properly. Take the spring, and then keep your finger underneath there, otherwise it'll go all the way down. It will kick your diaphragm out of this place it needs to be. And then you put a little bit of pressure on there. While you put those screws on. I just hold that right in the center with my thumb before we put the screws on there. Once you're able to get those tightened down, you can take your thumb off there. Make sure that moves freely. Take compressed air again. Blow through there, make sure that goes up and down. That is a carburetor on a Bombardier 650 Quest.